Black patriarch.
Let me give you, let's take Detroit, Michigan, and the recent reports from the Pew Foundation and U.S. Census. They showed them pretty clearly that they ranked all the cities, urban cities in the United States. The 10 poorest cities ranked 3 months ago in the entire United States. The 10 poorest cities, the 10 most dangerous cities, with the highest home foreclosure rates, with the highest high school dropout rates, with the highest imprisonment rates. Guess what they were? Cities where black folk are the majority populations. Detroit led the list in every category. And Detroit has 2 blacks in Congress. Blacks stuffed in large numbers into the state capitol. A black mayor, black city council, black school board, black school superintendent, and 85% black population, and yet they lead the nation and everything is bad. Because I tell y'all, there's no connection between the blackness and the benefits. And that's why you all ask me why I pull out of my project out of Detroit. It's a waste of time. In most of these cities now, you got politically, criminally incompetent blacks sitting in office. They don't understand politics. They don't understand even the oath that they swear. When a person gets sworn to an office, they take an allegiance and says, I protect and serve those who put me into office. We live in a nation of representative government, which means you're supposed to represent the people that put you in the office. And see, but in this country, blacks in office won't do it. I can find blacks right now in the United States Congress, Congressional Black Caucus, that will not stick up for black folk. They're so busy taking care of everybody but black folk to put them in office. They don't even have enough sense to know that as soon as the other groups that they're supporting get strong enough, they're going to take them out of office. And that way black folk didn't get anything when they were in office, they don't get anything when they're out of office. Blacks in office won't do it. I can find blacks right now in the United States Congress, Congressional Black Caucus, that will not stick up for black folk. They're so busy taking care of everybody but black folk to put them in office. They don't even have enough sense to know that as soon as the other groups that they're supporting get strong enough, they're going to take them out of office. And that way black folk didn't get anything when they were in office, they don't get anything when they're out of office. And we're going to have to start playing the game and winning by not only putting blacks in the office who are responsible to us. Now, I was talking to one of the city council members in Detroit, Michigan, and she had said, put out a statement that in a city that's 85 to 90% black, that she was sick and tired of hearing about blackness, and that she was into multicultural and diversity. In a city that's 85 to 90% black, and Arabs own 90% of the businesses. And I called her down front and said, "Look, come here a minute." I said, "Why don't you represent the people that put you in office? We are a nation of representative government, which means you're supposed to represent those who send you to office. When the whites send Strom Thurmond up from the South, Strom Thurmond come to trying to represent black folk. Only people who want to represent everybody is black folk. Everybody else comes up there in Washington D.C. to represent their own people. I said, why don't you represent the people that put you in the office? Black folk put you in the office. Why don't you represent them? She said, "Dr. Anderson, you just don't understand." I said, "Don't understand what, dear?" She says, "Well, you don't understand. Black folk own their own welfare. They're always looking for handouts. They're begging all the time. They're on drugs. They're having illegitimate babies out of wedlocks, and they're just outright stupid." I said, "Well, let me tell you, if they're stupid enough to elect you to office, then you go downtown and represent them. You go downtown and represent stupid people. I said, if you live in a city where 85% of the population are midgets, and midgets elect you to office, go downtown and represent midgets. What's so hard about that? What's so hard about the blacks in this city and the blacks in Congress representing black folk that put them into offices? They find it difficult. I say it's simple. What they prefer to do is, again, get away from blackness. That's the game. And see, this has been going on all through history. Let me go back and show you how they started doing something early. Let's go back now to
Detroit's unemployment rate, 12.7%. That compares with the national rate of 8.9%. Only half of Michigan counties had increases in population. The rest had declines.
There's new census data that finds the number of people living in the Motor City has plunged to a level not seen in more than a century.
This may be new to their neighborhood, but it's a problem that's been going on in Detroit for years. Abandoned, burned out houses, vacant factories, and overgrown parking lots. Now, needle after needle left behind by people, they say, who come to Detroit to buy their drugs, park here, and leave the dangerous and dirty remnants behind.
Looking at what the tragedy of Detroit, a tragedy that was decades in the making, can tell us about America. The city of Detroit has lost nearly 2/3 of its population since its post-war peak. Back in 1950, nearly 2 million people called the Motor City home. Today, that number is barely above 700,000. The tax base in Detroit has utterly evaporated, and now it has become the largest U.S. city in history ever to file for bankruptcy.
Over 1 million people have left the Motor City.
The cars, various industries, and some of the most soul-thumping music of our time. Tonight, Detroit is a statistic.
This was inevitable.
Detroit is struggling with an estimated $18 billion of debt and other liabilities.
People fleeing out of Detroit in every direction. All that red is people leaving.
Well, Detroit is a spectacular failure.
The fourth largest city in the U.S. filed for bankruptcy Thursday afternoon.
They went to other places hoping to save themselves from the catastrophe of that city.
After struggling with an $18 billion debt.
You know, millions of people's lives destroyed.
Its finances ravaged and its neighborhoods hollowed out by a long, slow decline in population and auto manufacturing.
Think about how far we've come together. We refuse to throw in the towel and do nothing. We refuse to let Detroit go bankrupt.
Do I love Detroit? Yes.
I love Detroit.
I love Detroit for the sports, go Lions, for the Red Wings.
Well, Detroit means to me, Detroit is home.
Detroit's a special place.
I love Detroit.
I love Detroit. I love it. I mean, I love it.
See my sweatshirt, I am Detroit, Lions head on, so yeah. I'm a big Detroit fan, you could say.
Besides the blue-collar aspect and hard-working people, there's a creative buzz around Detroit, and our past reflects on our future. We have high standards to hold up to.
What really built the city of Detroit were the things that are the substance of a market system: entrepreneurship and incentive. If you read the annals of Detroit, especially in the early 20th century, you can tell the Henry Fords and the suppliers, what came to be the suppliers, Durant, the message was out to all sorts of places in the U.S., upstate New York. Come to Detroit. That's where you can make your living, your fortune. We're getting together essentially what we call today a critical mass of entrepreneurship, invention, and Edison was part of that. And you had so many that tied in to give Detroit its economic preeminence in the 20th century.
The auto industry didn't just fuel it, it built Detroit. The companies were so successful, and the demand for cars went up. You know, after Henry Ford created the $5 day and cars became affordable to the masses, production increased. And with the increase in production meant jobs. So you had people moving from all over the country to Detroit for the auto jobs, because it was much better for them to be in a city and to get a job which paid a steady wage than to be working in the field, which may or may not yield a good harvest some years. So people flocked to the city, and it became one of the biggest, most metropolitan communities in the United States. all because of the auto industry.
And then so when we talk about the music industry, the same thing. You know, we're the birthplace of Motown, and it played a huge role in the fabric of this country. We're still the place that, you know, created a soundtrack for the nation and the world.
If there ever were a we can do, the patriotism in both world wars, World War I, a big supplier to the war effort, World War II, the arsenal of democracy.
Because I was brought up and reading in the schools and everything and such about how Detroit stopped everything it was doing during World War II and produced enough material to give to the Allies and basically crush fascism. And that's something that we're always proud of here.
Detroit had a worldwide reputation, well-deserved, patriotism to go with it, labor force to go with it, one that knew what it was doing. Within 40 miles of downtown Detroit, you could find any type of engineer that existed on the face of the earth. Now you tell me that isn't the raw ingredients for productivity and capital investment. That's what it was all about. That's what Detroit would have to restore in order to achieve a regrowth, rebirth, renaissance.
You are about to witness the very exciting story of a city and its people. It will be an adventure that will open new sights in familiar surroundings. It is a story of a city seeking new horizons in a resolute contest with great challenges. That city is Detroit, home of nearly 2 million people. Yes, Detroit is enjoying its finest hour. There is a renaissance, a rebirth in the city.
I have a love-hate relationship with Detroit.
I'm disappointed. I think the city could have been ran a little bit better.
There's not a lot about Detroit lately that I love.
I'm jealous of like the Chicago, our sister city. That's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of Detroit. Because there's like, if they're doing it, why can't we? You know what I'm saying? And I feel like we have more to offer. So why are we struggling and they really have to put them down? Like, why are they thriving and we're not? We should be stronger economically.
I guess we're like everyone else, we're not sure exactly how long Detroit will be, you know, who knows, 10 years.
It's like, damn, like they really forgot about this city, and it's sad.
Yeah, absolutely, it's sickening what has happened. And listening to my grandmother and my dad talk about growing up and what a safe city it was, and just what it's become. And I'm not afraid to go to Detroit. I know where I'm supposed to be. I've got my head on my shoulders at all times. But that a city that has such a storied history and participated in actually doing something in one of the great world events that now in areas looks like a third world city, it makes you both sick and makes you want to punch something.
The big three had 70% of the market, 80% of the market through the 70s into the 80s, and it started to decline when competition boosted.
It's on its way down as of I'll say mid to late 70s. You had a lot of things out of Detroit's control, but a lot of things in Detroit's control. But I'd say the greatest problem, the offset to the entrepreneurship that prevailed in the earlier part of the century, is that Detroit got hit with complacence. In the post-World War II era, there really wasn't any competitor worldwide up until 1970 that was a serious threat to Detroit. And when it began to appear, mostly from Japan, Detroit wasn't responding in any way, shape, or form effectively to these threats.
They were building cars that weren't what the consumers wanted, the quality wasn't as good.
I personally had a couple bad experiences with American cars. My first car in high school was a Dodge Neon. Had a lot of problems with it.
And so that's when the decline started. And they didn't recognize that, they were making money, they were fat and happy, both the workers and management, and they didn't realize that they needed to adjust before the fall.
GM, I remember this very well because they had a 3-year plan. This was back in 1987. So that was, to my mind, the benchmark date, 1987, when the automaker said, you know, we're not getting our market share. We continue to lose market share. Our profitability, except for the exceptional years, is not anywhere where it needs to be.
And so the money was coming in, but the demands kept getting higher and higher and higher, and nobody decided to adjust ahead of time.
The auto industry and its suppliers, the auto industry in total, and the ancillary and the tertiary industries that are supported by the auto sales, they all sought refuge in other states and other outstate Michigan areas.
Legacy costs helped bankrupt GM and Chrysler. Auto workers were guaranteed pensions. So now most people get 401ks. You invest yourself into it. The company sometimes matches it. And the auto companies just absolutely stayed away from that. So they were still letting people accrue pensions. And you had more people accruing and collecting on pensions than you had people working to pay off those pensions.
You know, this is the birthplace of the UAW, you know, up in Flint, where the sit-down strike happened in the 30s, I believe. So the union mentality, even if you're not part of the union, is ingrained here.
Unions played a role in society in the 50s. There were working conditions primarily. The workers wanted and demanded safer working conditions. They wanted cleaner environments, and they wanted healthier environments. And that's why they came into play. And they helped clean up some dangerous situations that were happening in auto plants all over the place. Over time, the contract provisions have gotten so restrictive. I mean, there are jokes that they used to tell, you know, a light bulb would go out and you had to call the union electrician to come change the light bulb. Even though it was your station, you couldn't turn around and change the light bulb. And so the provisions became so ridiculous that they've sort of made themselves irrelevant.
The union model has been unsustainable.
They used to have some ridiculous provisions. One of them was the Jobs Bank, where they paid laid off workers to come to work and do nothing. And there were workers who sat there for years and never worked on the auto floor again.
Unfortunately, the auto unions, again, used to a lot of agreements, a lot of strikes when they didn't get their way, were just reactionary. I have no other word to use, but totally reactionary to progress, to flexibility, job sharing, and so forth. This is my turf, and nobody intervenes. And if we don't get our way in terms of the contract, the wages, the benefits, you don't have a workforce. And unfortunately, that prevailed right up until 1998. So the second half, especially the second half of the 20th century, was impervious to the global necessities. The rest of the world was restructuring faster, and they were beginning to move to the South, the right-to-work states, where there's more flexibility. You don't have to be a member of a union or pay union dues to be an auto worker, and they trained their own. Even when the auto industry, the big three, were laying off workers because they were losing market share and capacity, the Hondas, Toyotas, Nissans didn't want our laid-off auto workers because they were, I remember this keenly, in their estimation, the Japanese, spoiled. They weren't the workforce. They'll start from scratch and make their own culture, and that's what they did.
Early on, I think that the automakers they dictated what happened. They certainly got special privileges within communities. They got special privileges for land. When things started to go south for them, they did look to the government once they started to have financial troubles. There's a famous issue that happened in Detroit that involved Poletown, where they used eminent domain to take over a neighborhood so they could build a plant.
My dad had actually grown up in the area that they were knocking down, and there was a huge fight. A lot of families that had grown up in the area. Some of the families that he had grown up with were still in the area. Some of their kids had stayed. And when the Poletown plant was proposed, a lot of people were upset and fighting that, or mad about it, because that was a vibrant neighborhood that a lot of people had fond memories of, and a lot of families had roots to. It was probably easier for GM to do, much easier, because they knew the people, they knew the players.
Poletown represented both confiscation of property, and I put that very bluntly, and a disorientation of an entire population, ethnic population in Detroit, for the benefit of promised jobs, 1,800, that mostly never materialized.
When GM wanted the land for Poletown, they basically decided that they were going to get it one way or another. And they had the government use eminent domain to get it for them. So they burned a lot of bridges with people. You now had a corporation coming in and taking over neighborhoods. And that didn't sit well with people.
Probably about 6 months before they actually started getting people out, he took the whole family down, showed us where he grew up, brought my grandmother, his mom down, and we took a tour of the place for half a day, went to the restaurant that they used to go to, first bar that he ever got a drink from and everything, because it was a very, very close, tight-knit neighborhood and area. They were upset, and then the people who lived there, I remember seeing stories, reading about in the Detroit News or the Free Press, these people that were just absolutely devastated that they'd lived there for 30 or 40 years, and why were they being uprooted?
People understood the jobs and they understood the potential, but people also understand their neighborhoods, and they don't want somebody to come in and take their house away so that they can build an auto plant.
It's the apotheosis of government, sort of, they're not just getting involved in the economy, they're literally confiscating property and giving it to politically favored groups.
For years, America's automakers have faced serious challenges. Burdensome costs, a shrinking share of the market, and declining profits. In recent months, the global financial crisis has made these challenges even more severe. Now some U.S. auto executives say that their companies are nearing collapse, and that the only way they can buy time to restructure is with help from the federal government. It's a difficult situation that involves fundamental questions about the proper role of government. On the one hand, government has a responsibility not to undermine the private enterprise system. On the other hand, government has a responsibility to safeguard the broader health and stability of our economy. Addressing the challenges in the auto industry requires us to balance these two responsibilities. If we were to allow the free market to take its course now, it would almost certainly lead to disorderly bankruptcy and liquidation for the automakers. Under ordinary economic circumstances, I would say this is the price that failed companies must pay. And I would not favor intervening to prevent the automakers from going out of business. But these are not ordinary circumstances.
I mean, at some point, you're going to need to slash benefits that are given to retirees or pensioners or whatever group it is. So, I think the lesson is that the longer you put off that reckoning point, the more damaging it's going to be to everyone involved on both sides of the equation. And Detroit's a perfect example of that.
When auto sales, anything that the automakers made, when that volume of sales was exceeding for 4 or 5 years in a row, 17 million units, unprecedented, where the automakers, the big three, should have been making profits hand over fist. They couldn't even break even. They were losing money. At that point, they realized the game was up. They were working in an end game, and they still were having labor disputes, labor stoppages. They couldn't stop the bleeding.
So they did go to the government, hat in hand, and said, we need help, and you need to bail us out.
Certainly, they were looking for a lifeline from D.C., and they got, a little aid. Certain industries were favored, but it just seemed to postpone the inevitable. The initial bailout was, there are lots of small businesses in hard times. Why do you choose them when they were shrinking? There were other manufacturers who were in the South that had good management practices. So why do you choose? And the question is, GM's coming. People are saying GM coming back, it's a success. But I think if you give any business $65 billion, they could be selling ketchup popsicles and could make a comeback.
GM, remember, also had the options of getting smaller quickly, much smaller, much more quickly. So I think the presence of intercession by a federal, state, other governments, assistance, simply delays and truncates the process of recovery in the entire auto industry. And I think that's what's happened in housing, it's what's happened in autos.
GM and Chrysler both got significant deals from the government to help them stay afloat. I think in the end what we found was that some of the provisions that were set up in the bankruptcy favored the unions more than they did some of the people who had invested in the company.
Would GM have gone away had they entered a traditional bankruptcy? No, but creditors wouldn't have had their bondholders, creditors would not have been, for lack of a better word, screwed the way they were under the government policy.
I think it was cronyism in that certain groups were favored. The UAW and its management were favored over bondholders and long-term creditors, which included middle-class pension funds, as far as the stakes of the company they got in the reorganization that really, shattered bankruptcy precedent.
It was an abridgment of contract. It also a terrible incentive precedent for the future, and I think will hurt Detroit, because Detroit now facing the same sorts of dichotomy and favoritism from political forces rather than the normal financial economic. You can do that. You can favor one group over another as a political matter, but that's a short time horizon, and the economics, which we are especially keen on, aren't encouraged by bad behavior.
And there are much more intangible costs to deals like that. The damage that's done to rule of law and faith in the sanctity of contracts by simply voiding obligations owed to certain creditors. I mean, that has damage far beyond the actual financial damage that is done to those creditors.
The way in which those cases proceeded, which is the fact that the UAW didn't take any haircuts.
How's it going, UAW? It is good to be with some auto workers today. All right, everybody have a seat. Get comfortable.
Stephen Ratner, for instance, confessed after the fact. Everybody else was asked to take a haircut, but not the UAW. And when you recognize that one of the reasons they were in that soup was because of these gold-plated salary and pension plans that they were paying the UAW workers, whereas everybody else in the American economy is having to adjust to the realities of the modern American economy, and the federal government was coming in and bailing these guys out, I think that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way.
We saw the government choosing winners and losers, and nowhere was this more evident than Delphi, which was a GM supplier that had been in bankruptcy. And in order to get GM out of bankruptcy sooner, the government decided to help shore up Delphi as well. What ended up happening was all of the non-union workers at Delphi had their pensions slashed by up to 70%, whereas the union workers, the people who were great allies with this administration, their pensions were made whole by GM. So we saw the government organizing and the company picking winners and losers based on their political status. So a lot of these retirees, they retired thinking that they had this money that was going to be there, and the government stepped in and said, no, only the union workers will keep their money.
Also cronyism to Fiat, that we basically gave away, a quality American auto company to an Italian company that was already in trouble even before it had acquired Chrysler, and Fiat really paid, it literally paid zero for Chrysler, and all it was contributing was sort of some intellectual property rights.
The auto bailouts are exhibit, we'll say, 1B of cronyism. If we take the bank bailouts as exhibit 1A, exhibit 1B. And the reason I say that is while a case could be made for a limited government intervention in that situation, what actually happened in those cases was cronyism run amok, which is first, it's very clear under the statute that TARP money, which was designed for bank bailouts, was not allowed to be used for car dealers. The second thing we see is when you actually look at the numbers, what you see is the entire loss to the American taxpayer came about as a result of preferential treatment given to the United Auto Workers in that case, which is if they had been treated as similarly situated parties would be treated in other cases, whether it's airline bankruptcies or other industries, taxpayers would have been paid back in full. And instead what we saw was the government intervening, transferring money to a very politically powerful interest groups, and running over the rights of other parties in order to enrich political supporters.
They've made it easier to sustain what had been bad behavior, and we can see that. You still have the same infrastructure, you still have a lot of the same management and workers that contributed to the problem.
those companies were run into the ground by their management. And they did the same thing at the banks, but it was a lot longer and more obvious decline. General Motors was hemorrhaging billions of dollars for years and just making those same garbage cars, I think is what people's perspective was. And anybody on the street could see that those were terrible cars and that they were paying their managers too much and that they were paying the UAW guys too much and they retired too early. And instead, they're bringing it back on us to bail them out for their terrible cars.
So GM's criticism was deserved. It was the worst performing and worst managed.
If you're providing like a short-term infusion of cash for whether it's a city or a company or an individual, but you're not changing the structure of how that entity brings in and then spends money, you're not addressing the underlying problem, so you're really just sort of delaying the inevitable. What you need to be doing is reducing that incentive to get involved in the political process, and you do that by reducing the control that the government or that political actors have over the economy.
Once you not only bail out an industry like Detroit, but you make the argument that President Obama has is that it's a success. You're suggesting it's a role model for the country. You're suggesting that picking winners and losers is something the government can do and should do. But one of the things we know, going back to the very beginning of American history, was the framers themselves were concerned about cronyism. They were concerned about well-organized interest groups, what they called factions, commandeering the government in order to enrich themselves. They set up a constitutional structure that was designed to prevent that from happening. I think what we've seen over the course of the 20th century and reaching a new level when it came to the financial crisis was an erosion of those constitutional constraints on the ability of the government to enrich special interest factions, choose whatever word that you want to choose. And the reason why they did that was to limit the politicians and to limit the special interest. And so once you take those restraints off, basically what I think we're unfortunately seeing is like the law of gravity, or at least sort of seeing that way to the founders, which is as soon as you give interest groups and politicians the opportunity to enter into these corrupt bargains, they take them, if they think that it's going to give them some sort of gain. And I think, unfortunately, that's what we've been seeing, is an erosion of the constitutional culture, and in the wake of that, an erosion of the political culture, where this seems to become more and more acceptable.
The market says, I will reward those who do the right thing better, faster, cheaper, more secure for consumers. That's their job. And if you put barriers to their doing that job, they're going to be weaker and susceptible to failure. If they fail and you bail them out at others' expense, then the moral thing to do is say to the people from whom you've taken money, have I made you weaker? And find out that aspect. And if you ignore that, which we've done superlatively in Michigan, in Detroit, and in the nation, you are weakening the nation, its currency, its trust, its confidence. And as a market system, you will fail.
It's official. Taxpayers are the big losers in that big auto bailout. The Treasury Department announcing it'll unload its remaining shares in General Motors by the end of the year. The total cost to you, more than $11 billion. That's on top of the billion plus we lost on rescuing Chrysler.
The administration said, well, this was never about turning a profit, when all throughout the 2012 campaign and all throughout the 2009 selling of the auto bailout, we were told, oh, this is going to be a net gain for taxpayers. And taxpayers were able to recoup their investments into the banks. They were able to recoup their investments into AIG. GM and Chrysler were the only two entities that were unable to result in a profit for the taxpayers.
So that's the same thing that's happening with Detroit, the city right now, for all the same reasons, that these promises were made, very often knowing that they would never be fulfilled.
President Obama chose some very unfortunate words when he said, we saved Detroit, when what he really meant was, we saved General Motors and Chrysler.
Well, I think it's ironic that people were saying, well, you need to bail out GM and Chrysler because otherwise Detroit will go bankrupt, and then it turned out anyway, save cronyism for two companies, did not solve the long-term structural problems of Detroit, both in competitiveness and in terms of the tax and regulatory system.
If the bailout saved Detroit, then why is Detroit bankrupt today? It simply makes it easier if you have the same forces in place to repeat the errors or to kick a can down the road. And so now it's in worse shape than ever, and no real prospects of reemerging as a self-sufficient, confident entity.
I think the actual effect of the auto bailouts was kind of beside the point, which is that this was just kind of economic industrial planning, right? Which is they wanted to bail out a powerful interest group, which was the UAW. The government wanted to get their tentacles into these companies in order to get them making green cars and sort of more entrench government environmental and other policies into them, which they succeeded in doing in a variety of ways. And then if the long-term effect had also been to be able to help Detroit, I think that would have been fine. As we know, one of the impacts of this is that a lot of jobs have ended up leaving Detroit anyway. We bailed out these companies, a lot of jobs left Detroit.
Detroit is weaker, its tax base is reduced. The firms that are there now, many of them have been brought into Detroit by promises of tax moratoria, 12-year tax, no payments or special favors, as long as there's a promise to create jobs, which no one 10 years hence has bothered to monitor.
So we had an American city, once the most prosperous city in the entire country, that owes $20 billion to retirees, to former workers, to its creditors, and they can't pay it. They can't pay it. $20 billion, that is a large chunk of that city's annual budget, and they couldn't pay those bills.
Our cities that relied on one industry, auto industry, Flint, Michigan, going through the same issue. Highland Park, going through the same issue. Benton Harbor, going through the same issue. Ecorse, same issue. One of our major issues in the city of Detroit is that we don't have lighting, public lighting. The public lighting is inefficient, let me just say. So we have 80,000 lights in the city of Detroit. Half of them are out.
Trash pickups, horrendous. They've had problems with response times with the fire department. The fire department itself has got equipment that they can't even use. It's just so outdated and broken down that they don't have the adequate resources to do their jobs.
And what we've just seen is a long-term deterioration of the city that really wasn't going to be fixed without some sort of strong medicine like bankruptcy.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. We are gratified with the court's ruling today regarding the city's eligibility to pursue a plan of adjustment under Chapter 9 of the Federal Bankruptcy Code.
If the bankruptcy helps, that'd be great. Sometimes you have to start over with a clean slate, and I think that's what we need to do.
I don't know. I hope they can come out of it. I know there's a big opportunity for the future of Detroit. I got my fingers crossed.
Well, it kind of sucks for Detroit, but I think they'll get back on their feet.
I feel bad about it, but it has to be done. Oftentimes, the only way back to stability is through drastic means.
I think it's a shame, and I think, it was bound to happen eventually, but I think Detroit can rebound. I have faith. So.
Well, it's a process that had to be done. It was long in the waking for so many years, and I'm finally glad that it's finally trying to get its finances back in order, but it really needs it in order for the city to survive.
I think it's a necessary step towards a better future for the city.
Bankruptcy provides a potential way of righting that ship, of right-sizing the city and sort of getting everything the way that it's supposed to be.
So yes, I do think it would be better off if they went bankrupt earlier, so they could have made these reforms that need to be made.
The sooner Detroit filed bankruptcy, the better, in my opinion, because you sort of come to terms with this massive disconnect in their finances. And the longer you put that off, the more painful it's going to be. We see that on virtually every level of government now, and cities that refuse to come to terms with that. We see things like what happened in San Bernardino, California, or other towns in California that are just absolutely, they're just crushed because for years they refused to address this big disconnect. So, yeah, so I think if they had done it sooner, it would have been better. If they had done it a decade ago, it would have been better.
Even though bankruptcy is obviously the right thing for Detroit in retrospect, there's always very powerful special interests that are pushing against that. And in particular, the public employees unions, I think, accurately saw what was going to happen if Detroit did go into bankruptcy. And as a result, there was a lot of political blowback against it. And of course, it wasn't really until they got the current manager, Kevin Orr, who really pushed things to the wall in order to do that. One of the problems with pensions generally is the political power of the public employee unions. And whether that is trying to correct pensions outside bankruptcy or them trying to stave off a bankruptcy filing because they know what bankruptcy means for these pensions, getting over that political hurdle is a very difficult jump.
But as I said before, we have a lot of work ahead of us. And what I would ask both our creditors, none of whom, by the way, filed an objection to our eligibility, but equally important, our labor partners, to come forward with us and to take this opportunity, even in the process of litigation and appeals, to try to get at the sorely needed reform that this city has got to achieve so we can move forward into a new day.
The city really needs to put their business in order to do that. They really can't rely on the federal government to handhold them through the process. There has to be a 50-50 plus on that.
You hope that the new mayor, you want to see the city do good.
We're strong enough to make it work.
The city itself, it needs huge structural changes. And we've got a mayor who's in prison again, for corruption, and he ruined the city in a time that he could have helped build it up. And you've got to rid the city of that attitude of the city sort of falls within itself, where Detroiters are very territorial about Detroit.
It is one of the weirdest dynamics. I can sit next to somebody at a Lions game or a baseball game and have a great conversation, and they absolutely see the world differently in terms of what is good in terms of politics and policy. And I try not to question people's heart or motives, but it really has been one of the most frustrating things living in this area in seeing that people in Detroit going through this bankruptcy now, there's still a vocal, there may be a minority, but a very vocal, passionate group of people who don't see how the city's been run for the past 40 or 50 years as a problem. That it's because Detroit hasn't gotten enough money from the federal government. The state of Michigan hasn't, given them their share back. It really is one of the most frustrating things about living in this area and being all over the country like I have been. It doesn't really exist like it does here in Detroit.
Detroit provides the warning of what happens if you go down the path where you're constantly making short-term political goals at the expense of the long-term viability of the city.
They're under external financial management, and when that's gone, given what we know remains in Detroit in terms of city council and mayor, I don't see reform.
We clearly know that we have a financial challenge. Clearly know we have other issues that we have to deal with, but you need to clearly know that we're working on them. And we're not taking them for granted. Again, we're not just asking for, the state to give us a ton of money, a blank check. We want the opportunity to work on these issues. And when you see the city of Detroit, the condition that it's in right now, this has been gaining for 40, 50 years. And so you're seeing this generation, a new generation of Detroiters who are stepping up and saying enough is enough. I'm tired of seeing a city like this. What can I do to help? What can I do to turn it around? Because I don't want my kids or your kids having to go through the same thing that we did. The reins have been now handed over to a different generation of leaders. and whether those leaders are in city government or within the community. These are new folks who are looking to find ways to be a major player again on a national scale, and not just a news clip, a news blip. We're ready, and I'm excited about, again, what's coming. But I'm even more excited about being a part of the reason why we're going to be back on the national scale, and not just as a news clip, but as that major comeback city.
I think what people need to know most about Detroit is that if it looks back 100 years to what were the foundations that made this a great city and a premier example for what works in the United States as a premier economy, not just in the world, but in the history of the world. It was the incentives, the individual being able to follow one's dreams without a lot of taxation, hindrance, regulation that made no sense, accountability, that they were on their own. If they made products and services that pleased the public, they grew, and others emulated their example. And if we don't get back to that very fundamental facet of a free market enterprise system, a competitive system, then yes, you'll see more and more subsidies for failure. And that would be a crime.
Detroit is unsurpassed for opportunity and growth. The friendliness of its people reaches out. The warmth of the city, the excitement of change, the dedication to progress, social, spiritual, cultural, and material, is equaled only by its 20th century vision. The city on the Straits welcomes you to share that vision as it continues to plan, to build, and yes, to dream.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessel Noor in Baltimore. Detroit's 2013 bankruptcy, the largest of its kind in history, was not inevitable, and neither is Chicago's. But the austerity hawks don't want you to know that. That's according to a new piece by Saqib Bhatti in These Times. He's now joining us. He's a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and director of the Refund America Project. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So conventional wisdom dictates that Detroit had to go bankrupt because of its bloated public pensions. You have a different take on this and the road that Detroit took to address its bankruptcy, and what the lessons are for the rest of the country, including cities like Chicago.
Right. No, there's this narrative out there that Detroit went bankrupt, that the bankruptcy was inevitable because of the city's pensions. And in fact, to emerge from bankruptcy, the city did end up cutting pensions for its retirees. But the thing that people don't realize is that Detroit didn't cut pensions to get out of bankruptcy. Detroit filed bankruptcy so they could cut pensions. The reality is that there was a broader political agenda, and cutting pensions was really high on that list. And bankruptcy was the means that they used to accomplish that goal. There was nothing about the Detroit bankruptcy that was inevitable. It was a political decision made by state officials in conjunction with the emergency manager of the city to really push the city into bankruptcy so they could get around state constitutional prohibitions against slashing pensions.
And in your story, you mentioned how many other cities have been compared to what could be the next Detroit, including cities like Baltimore. But commentators say that state law would prevent that from happening. But that was also the case in Detroit. Is that correct?
Right. So in Detroit, Michigan state law now permits municipalities to file bankruptcy. Currently, there's 26 states that do not allow it. So cities file bankruptcy under Chapter 9 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. But under Chapter 9, the the filing actually has to be authorized by the state. And so currently there's 26 states that do not authorize it. The thing that's interesting is when people talk about the next Detroit, they seem to completely disregard that fact. So one city that's often mentioned as the next Detroit is Chicago. Well, in Chicago, Chicago's in Illinois. Illinois does not allow municipalities to file bankruptcy. There's a bill before the legislature right now to try to change that, but that bill is not passing. It's basically dead on arrival. And the other thing that's interesting is we've also seen people talk about states going bankrupt. And that's another thing that's just not possible. The bankruptcy code, federal law does not allow states to go bankrupt, period. And so what we're seeing in a lot of places is this talk of bankruptcy is basically part of a political agenda to really scare people into accepting draconian cuts and austerity agenda. And the idea is that if you sort of scare people enough and say, look what happened to Detroit, you don't want that to happen to your city, you can force them to accept painful cuts. You can really move a radically regressive agenda just by scaring people, even though bankruptcy is typically not even on the table.
And so talk about what the alternatives to this could be, because one of the things you propose is raising taxes, but critics would say taxes are high enough, and if you raise taxes, you're just going to drive away businesses, and you're only going to further hurt the economy.
Right. The issue is not raising any taxes; it's raising progressive taxes, right? So one of the key things that we have right now in a lot of places is that cities rely on for most of their funding from property taxes, and property taxes can be done in a progressive way, but typically they're not. And so it really is, how do we actually figure out how to change that? So in Illinois, for instance, where Illinois has the 5th most regressive tax system in the country, 2/3 of corporations pay no income taxes at all. So we should be figuring out how we're actually flipping that on its head and creating a fair tax system that allows us to properly fund services while also sort of meeting our obligations to workers, retirees, and everyone else. Because of course, at the end of the day, funding workers who provide the services is part of funding the services. And we saw this in Los Angeles, that after the financial crash, the city's budget took a steep hit, and they laid off 5,000 workers. Well, those 5,000 workers provide a lot of services, and the thing that sort of happened since 2008 is that all sorts of service provisions have gone down. And so, we're often what the right and sort of Republicans, conservative Democrats often try to do is say that, well, if you raise taxes to you're doing that on the backs of on the backs of people who are trying to get services. They try to pit service recipients against service providers. And the correct solution is that we need proper funding for services, period. And proper funding for services means you got to fund the workers as well as the actual delivery of the service, and that's how you actually end up with a good, healthy economy. The other thing that's important to note is when we talk about helping the economy, if you eliminate, if you sort of slash pensions down to drastically, that actually has a huge and negative impact on the economy. Some of the best jobs in cities, particularly in cities with that are predominantly or majority minority, are often public sector jobs. And if you're actually slashing pensions or going after the public sector, that's going to have a huge impact on the broader economy in the city.
And so how do we change this conversation? Because, as you alluded to, this threat of bankruptcy is being used to go after public sector pensions. In Baltimore, this financial shortfall has led to a similar move to what's happened in Detroit. Thousands of people have had their water cut off because they say the city, because the city says they are owed millions of dollars in overdue water bills. So how do we rephrase that conversation? How do we put the wealthy kind of on the defensive instead of always being on the offensive?
I mean, it's important to really shine a light on who is paying their fair share and who is not. And looking at any crisis, it's also important to look at who's profiting off of it. You mentioned the example of the Baltimore water and the Detroit water. Well, in both of those cases, one of the big profiteers was actually Wall Street banks that had roped both the city of Detroit and the city of Baltimore into interest rate swap deals that completely backfired as a result of the economic crash. And they ended up costing both cities, Detroit and Baltimore, tens of millions each year. And so, you know, in the case of Detroit, the Detroit Water Department had to pay more than $500 million in penalties on these swaps in 2012. And as a result of that, the water bill skyrocketed because they had to take out a new bond to pay that off. And currently, about 40% of the water bill goes towards paying off those swaps. And the thing that's the kicker there is that there's actually a very strong legal argument that those swaps were illegally done, and that if the city were to actually file a lawsuit to get that money back, they could potentially recover that money. But that's never been on the table. Instead, there's a big push to really just turn off people's water, even if they're only behind a couple of payments. You know, they'll turn off people's water for $150, but they're not trying to recover the $500 million that they paid to the banks. And we have a similar thing happening in Baltimore, where the interest rate swaps in Baltimore were actually directly linked. A lot of them were directly linked to the water and wastewater system, and they've actually really sucked a lot of money out of budget. And so, I mean, that's just one way that we can start shining a light on who's not paying their fair share. But really, the key thing is looking at these types of financial deals, looking at corporate tax subsidies, looking at you know, who are the people who are lobbying to keep taxes down, particularly progressive taxes, because the solution is not cutting. The fact is that you know, we've had an anti-government, anti-tax environment in this country for the past 35 years since you know, Ronald Reagan's presidency. And we've actually cut services to the bone already. We can't cut out any more without permanently crippling ourselves. We need to actually start finding ways to put more money on the table so we can properly fund the services that we all know that we need and deserve.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.
And the last one I'm going to give a point is Detroit, Michigan. Going into Detroit, Michigan is 84% black. Now I go into the city, they got a black mayor, a black city council, a black board of education, and a black school superintendent, and a black police chief. They said, Dr. Anderson said, since you're here, we're going to give you a trophy and a plaque. Say something nice to us. I said, first of all, before I say something nice, what are you doing for black folk in the city? They said, we got an Office of Minority Business. I said, you got an Office of Minority Business? They said, yeah, that's the first office you should have closed down. You got an 84% black city, and you got an Office of Minority Business for black folk? They said, yes. I said, somebody is not, the light's on, but nobody's home. The first thing you must learn is when you become the majority, you must act like the majority. You see what I'm saying? In Detroit, Michigan, it's just reversed. You got an 84% black city, and you got and a 3% white population. The blacks are acting like they're the minority, and then when they're the majority, and the white minority is acting like they're the majority. So everything downtown is owned by whites, everything in the city is owned by whites. Blacks own nothing. And because the blacks can't get their mentality straight about learning how to practice and learn how to win. And so I go look at the contracts for services and goods in a city like Detroit, 97% of everything in Detroit for services and goods and contracts go to whites, and the city is 84% black. Because blacks don't understand that they'll still be winning. And I told them, I said, first, they said, what would you do? I said, first of all, I would sue all of you. Because that's against the law. Because you see, our good jurist, Clarence Thomas, has already ruled, saying that you cannot bypass a majority to give to a minority. You all got to get tricky. When you become the majority, you practice that. Say, oh, we're the majority now. You see? When you build these communities, you become the majority. And you start to winning. Because remember, the majority wins, the minority loses. And every time you use the word minority, you say, I'm a loser. It creates a negative mindset. Quit putting that negative mindset in your children's head. And say, when you become the majority, we're going to win.
The city of Detroit has always been a symbol for America, a land of opportunity where hard work can earn you a happy life. But now Detroit has become the flip side of the American dream. It has become the American nightmare. With thousands of new residents pouring into Detroit to work in the factories that were producing the planes, tanks, and bullets for World War II, tensions between black and white Detroiters dominated the streets. Poor housing conditions and high rents in the black neighborhoods along Hastings Street added fuel to the fire. As the war years and the riot of '43 faded into memory, the U.S. auto industry boomed, and Detroit attracted more and more African Americans from the South, many of whom were able to own their own homes and live their version of the American dream.
World War II, we had the industrial might. The factories were here.
By the late 50s, the auto industry began to move their factories outside of the city, and the population started its long decline. And as social change swept the country in the late 1960s, Detroit was poised on the brink of disaster.
Frequently called the most cosmopolitan city of the Midwest, Detroit today stands at the threshold of a bright new future.
It was one of the worst big city riots of the 60s. In only 5 days, 43 people were killed, 700 fires were set, 2,500 stores were looted, 7,000 people were arrested. The riot was sparked by tension between black residents and white cops. It was bred by poverty, hopelessness, and despair.
Pseudo, I'm going to work. And the police officer, a guy, said, well, why don't you take the test to be a police officer? I had no inclination to be a police officer. We were running from the big boy. Police were horrible. They used to beat us with whips. At any rate, that police officer, his name was Gallo. I didn't know at that time he got 40 hours vacation time for signing up a minority after the riots.
But after the fires and 43 were killed, store owners moved out, refused to rebuild. Many whose apartments were gutted also cleared out, leaving mostly the sad and the hopeless. They live in despair, constant reminders of the past.
As the 70s dawned and the flames of 12th Street slowly cooled, the white population of Detroit began one of the largest migrations in U.S. history. In 1960, Detroit had almost 1.2 million white residents. By 1980, there were only 400,000. Businesses evaporated. Once thriving commercial strips like Gratiot, Grand River, and Livernois became ghost towns. The murder rate soared. According to FBI statistics, in 1960, there'd been 172 homicides in the city. In 1970, there were 495, and by '74, there were nearly 800. Detroit had ceased to be Motown and was now known all across America as the Murder City.
The crime of murder is not unusual in this country, and nowhere is that more apparent than in Detroit.
The 750 murders last year was a record for Detroit, murder capital of the country. Detroit's murder rate is twice that of New York and Chicago. It is 4 times that of some cities. Why does Detroit have more murders? Drug pushers, procurers, killers are considered heroes of sorts. Drugs play a part in about 1/4 of the killings, but experts say just living in such miserable surroundings causes frustrations that lead to violence. And violence is common here.
I get that nervous feeling. Sometimes I'm looking from one side to the other, behind and front, afraid someone might walk up behind me and push me down and snatch my purse.
At his inauguration a few days ago, Detroit's new mayor, Coleman Young, warned criminals in no uncertain terms.
I issue open warnings now to all dope pushers, to all rip-off artists, to all mothers. And I don't give a damn if they're black or white, if they wear super fly suits or blue uniforms and silver badges. Hit the road.
Other cities have all the problems Detroit has, but for some reason as yet unknown, their citizens don't kill each other as often.
The Detroit Police Department had the highest rate of killings per officer of any major city. The GM, Ford, and Chrysler sales nosedived. Detroit struggled with the nation's highest urban unemployment rate and became ground zero for the deadliest of all illegal narcotics, heroin.
What has been recession elsewhere has been depression in Detroit. 6 out of 10 teenagers can't get work. Many have quit school and have no skills.
When we have from 8,000 to 9,000 dropouts every year, for a decade you got from 90 to 100,000 people. Now what do you think they're doing? They come out of school with no skill. They come out of school with a poor education. Nobody can hire them.
Detroit, like any major city, has had youth gangs for many years. They give themselves names like the Errol Flynns and the Black Killers.
Led by the Nix brothers, Frank Cunningham and Stan Cherry, the Errol Flynns controlled the area along Kercheval Street between Mount Elliott and Compton. The Black Killers, or BKs as they were known in the street, were led by the Took brothers, along with Donnie King and Jeff Dye. Their turf was bounded by Shoemaker on the north, Mack on the south, Connor on the east, and Cadillac on the west.
Detroit's city police are so busy and overworked trying to control the city's street gangs of young hoodlums that the mayor asked for help from the state police, and today he got it. The state took over patrolling of the freeways in Detroit, so the city police could be relieved of that duty and give more attention to the street gangs. The other night, a young man's car had a flat tire on the freeway, and while he was fixing it, he was attacked by young hoodlums and beaten.
What more fitting than that Detroit, the world's automobile capital, should hold the world's largest automobile show. Mammoth Cobo Hall, geared to conventions of every kind and size, houses all kinds of national and regional events.
Last Sunday night, 150 youth gang members rioted during a rock concert in Cobo Hall, Detroit's downtown arena. They robbed and beat people and vandalized the arena. One woman was raped, 80 people were arrested.
After the riot at the concert, the city responded with force, and one gang member who didn't want his face shown told us the gangs are feeling police pressure.
Can't do too much with the man out there on the street like he is. You know. So as of right now, we're going to close things down.
Most Detroiters, including those on the east side where the gangs live, support the strong measures.
Yeah, I mean, somebody needs to crack down, you know, because it's rough. It's rough, ain't no doubt about that. It's sure enough rough.
The hoods are taking over the school.
Guns, knives. It's a situation of constant terror and constant anxiety, and students are getting killed outside schools. Intruders are coming in, running through schools, assaulting people. There's a constant level of tension.
Detroit's public schools began to resemble prisons more than places to learn, and all the problems of the street, drugs, robbery, and even murder, welcomed themselves into the corridors of the city's schools.
He got up, started swinging on me, so I started swinging back. Then he grabbed me, and then he stuck me with a knife on my side right here.
Just about every month there's a gun, some type of gun.
Nowhere is the problem of school violence more apparent than in Detroit. Last year, nearly 10,000 students were punished for committing crimes, including rape, arson, and attempted murder. School officials say violent crime is up again this year. The victims, students and teachers.
At the end of the class period, he struck me from behind with a chair and knocked me unconscious.
Young people, particularly minorities, either 60% of them can't even get jobs, even if they're good, go through school, etc. They're going to become turned off. They're going to become alienated.
And I just turned around like that. Next thing I know, I got hit with a 45.
Violent children come to school. Those violent children are the product of a violent culture.
Detroit teachers say at just one school, 16 guns have been confiscated from students so far this year.
If they were to check lockers, you'd come across with a big arsenal. It's just a fact of life.
Charmaine Jones and Tommy Henderson used to fear being ripped off or injured at Mumford High, one of the toughest schools in Detroit.
There was a time when kids couldn't even wear their coats on around here without somebody coming around and taking them off or getting a gun in your face.
Among big cities last year, Detroit had the highest murder rate and the highest unemployment rate. White people have left this city in record numbers. Experts say many of the black people who remain are worse off now than they were before the riots in 1967.
Murder was in the heart of many Detroiters, not just the gangsters. The long and deep struggles of the U.S. auto industry engendered irrational hatred and fear of Japan and its cars in the minds of many of those unemployed or living under the shadow of Detroit's dying economy. In 1982, right down the street from Chrysler World headquarters in Highland Park, 2 white auto workers beat a Chinese man to death when they mistook him for Japanese inside the Fancy Pants Bar on Woodward Avenue, and the entire nation once again looked on in shock at the Murder City.
Detroit is armed and dangerous. There are an estimated 1.2 million guns here, more guns than there are people.
This 22 automatic, I keep that one under my pillow with me.
Along with his 22, Art Sims owns a 9mm automatic pistol, an assault rifle, and a sawed-off shotgun. He lives in one of Detroit's better neighborhoods.
5 streets down, you got crack dealers, and you got people breaking in. They come down here, they see nice houses, they see nice things, and they want to break in. So I got to protect myself from them.
You're prepared to use those?
Yeah, at all times.
Even cultural icons and civil rights heroes were not safe in Detroit.
For almost 40 years, Rosa Parks has been a symbol of dignity and strength in the civil rights struggle. Last night, however, she became another crime statistic when a man who reeked of alcohol broke into her Detroit home and demanded money.
He said, "You're going to make me hurt you if you don't give it all to me." And of course, that's when he started pushing me around and hitting me.
It's called carjacking, stealing a car from its driver at gunpoint, and it's become a serious problem in most major cities. Hardest hit, it appears, is Detroit, where there were at least 13 carjackings this weekend alone.
Specialist Anthony Riggs, age 22, got 2 weeks leave to visit his wife in Detroit. Early this morning, as Specialist Riggs loaded his wife's belongings into a moving van, he was shot dead by an unknown enemy, an apparent victim of urban warfare.
I said ain't no way to live. It's hard. That's the second person yesterday that I know that got killed, shot and killed on the street.
So far this year, 128 people have been murdered in Detroit. 125 were killed in action during Desert Storm. Specialist Riggs had been safer in Saudi Arabia.
In the month of August alone, there were more than 50 carjackings in the Detroit suburbs and a whopping 325 in the city.
After years of being investigated for corruption by the federal government, Detroit Police Chief William Hurt was indicted for stealing $2 million from a secret fund of drug forfeiture money.
Detroit's 5-term Mayor Coleman Young and his police department are in the eye of a storm.
Did you hear what I said? As far as I'm concerned, the press conference is over. Move him out. Move him out.
In a 3-month front-page scandal that has the whole town talking, the FBI and a federal grand jury are investigating an alleged $1 million police corruption scheme. This man, Kenneth Weiner, a former deputy police chief appointed by the mayor, is the key suspect, linked to an illegal diversion of money from a secret police fund controlled by the chief for use in undercover drug buys.
I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't commit any crime. Period.
How most of the money was spent is a mystery, but $160,000 went to armor plate the mayor's 2 limousines. $17,000 bought Uzis and semi-automatic pistols for his bodyguards. Another $130,000 paid for security at Young's mansion. And Police Chief Hart insists he knew nothing about this. $72,000 in rent payments on this Beverly Hills house, leased by his daughter for 2 years. The corruption probe is an embarrassment for a city long plagued by drug-related crime, where inner-city dwellers often complain that police are unequipped to shut down crack houses fast enough.
I know the city is upside down until we can get back on course with the police department.
The city will stay upside down, many think, until the mayor and his police chief disclose what they know to investigators.
Mayor Coleman Young narrowly avoided prosecution, but Chief Hart was convicted and served 10 years in prison. Upon his release, he worked briefly as a shoe salesman before dying of a heart attack. Since the new millennium opened, downtown Detroit has been transformed from a ghost town into a small green zone of giant new buildings and development projects. Many of the new buildings sit vacant and the city infrastructure is crumbling. The Detroit police solve less than 40% of the homicides, and business owners are nervous.
This is a club called Cliff Bells. It was an old supper club from the 30s. The more you have here, the more vulnerable you are. Because when it dries up around here, it dries up bad. And you can see it, you know. But just a few weeks ago here, a customer left, and three of my customers had walked out of here and walked down the street, and we're halfway down the block, and you know, SUV rolled up, and the guy jumped out with a shotgun and smacked the guy with it, smacked this kid in his face, and took, you know, robbed him.
They have a robbery here in Detroit, man. They stick up a dude. The dude only have $20 on him, right? They stick the dude up, take the $20, shoot the dude, bow, bow, kill the dude for $20. You understand what I'm saying? And the difference what I see with New York, growing up in New York, a lot of brothers respect the life more differently, man. They'll watch you. They'll watch you for a week, or watch you for a week or two, see that you're driving a Lex or Benz, making that money. They watch your wife, your kids, see how you're driving, see how you're living, and they just watch you with the cameras and the binoculars for like a month, 2 months, 3 months. They're going to catch you for the gusto. They're going to catch you for 500 or a million, opposed to killing you for $20. You know what I'm trying to say?
In 2007, Detroit had more murders than Los Angeles, a city with 3 million more people. In fact, Detroit had almost as many murders as New York, a city with 8 million more people. In the national media, interest in Detroit as a symbol of America's dark side has waned, as the city is now so socially and economically isolated from the mainstream that, for the average American, death in Detroit is every bit as distant as famine in Africa or war in Afghanistan. What the future holds for Detroit is uncertain, but one thing will always be true: Detroit is the murder city.
Today our conversation is going to be quite interesting. We're going to be talking about the history of African-American political leadership in the city of Detroit. We say it's been almost 40 years. How do we get here, and where do we go from here?
This segment is extremely important. We're going to deal with the history of African-American political leadership in Detroit, but also some of the history leading up to 1973 when Mayor Coleman Alexander Young is elected.
Okay.
A few reasons why we're doing this segment. What really, ticks me off is why I hear people calling in saying, we've had 40 years of African-American leadership, you ran it in the ground, we need somebody else to correct this, or they just want to put all the blame on African-American leadership. And I'm not saying, none of us are saying that there isn't enough blame to go around. None of us are saying
because I want to be
on both sides. Absolutely.
Because I want to be clear about that. That we can't, because there are those who say, you cannot say that there haven't been bad decision making.
There were mistakes on both sides.
Both, right. Okay.
Absolutely.
But here's the difficulty I have with just blame with the blame on where it looks like we're 100% victim, is that having covered African American business owners in the city of Detroit, car dealers specifically, working for the Wall Street Journal, you can't imagine how many of the black car dealers, including those who now have gone on Porterfield Wilson's widow and stuff, who will tell you that there was black folks who drove to the suburbs to buy their cars from other folks when their dealerships here in the city. It was it was a total distrust and a lack of support. A lot of the businesses failed because we didn't support them anymore.
Well, I've talked about that before.
It was a self kind of hatred that was going on at the same time as this disenfranchisement is what you discussed.
Absolutely.
Because we could have saved our own selves if we had invested in our own selves.
Well, there were some things that we could have done, and we made some mistakes. And I've said it before on your show. One of our biggest problems is we hate who we are and love who we can't be. We hate who we are as African people, love who we can't be as Europeans. And we've talked about before how we spend, Dr. Claude Anderson, the clip we just played to start this out, he said, we spend 98% of our dollars with people that don't look like us.